Welcome, weary traveler, to the next chapter of our long journey through the forgotten histories of the lands between. You have found your way back to Night's Embrace, where we walk slowly through the deepest mysteries of ancient realms, where time moves like honey, and every word carries the weight of ages long dissolved into shadow and memory. Tonight we venture beyond the primordial crucible we explored in our last gathering, beyond the wild, chaotic unity where all life once blended in radiant harmony. Tonight we delve into the empires that rose from that sacred confusion, civilizations that dared to touch the divine through their own sacred means, each pursuing transcendence along paths that would soon be branded heretical by those who came after. These are the lost empires they don't want you to know about, the kingdoms of stone and storm, flame and spirit, silver and starlight, that once painted the world in colors far richer than gold. In the time before the Erd tree's golden light dimmed the ancient stars, when magic flowed wild as rushing water and death danced with life in eternal spirals, the lands between bloomed with a diversity of worship that would make the later Golden Order seem pale and rigid by comparison. From floating cities that bent time itself to their will, to underground realms that defied the very cosmos, to mountain peaks where giants tended flames that could burn even the gods. These were not primitive peoples stumbling in darkness, but sophisticated civilizations that had found their own ways to commune with forces beyond mortal understanding. Their stories, preserved in crumbling stone and whispered incantations, in the dreams of those who remember and the nightmares of those who tried to forget. These tales reveal a world where there were as many paths to divinity as there were souls brave enough to walk them. The greater will would eventually cast its cosmic shadow across all these diverse traditions, forcing them into exile, underground, or extinction, but their echoes remain, calling to us across the centuries, like distant songs of what once was, and perhaps what might yet be again. So settle deeper into your chair, let the fireplace warmth chase away the evening chill, and allow your mind to drift back through the mists of time, to an age when empires rose, not through conquest and dominion, but through devotion so pure it could reshape reality itself. Tonight we remember the forgotten kingdoms, the lost peoples, the sacred traditions that dare to say there is more than one way to touch the infinite. High above the eastern seas, where storm clouds gather in eternal dance and lightning writes its poetry across the darkening sky, there once floated the most ancient and magnificent of all empires, Farum Azula, the crumbling celestial city of the dragons. Here, in sublime defiance of earthly law and mortal expectation, soared a civilization built from gravel stone, infused with primordial gold, its gothic spires and impossible arches piercing through the very fabric of time itself, like needles through silk. This was no mere city, but a living testament to what could be achieved when beings touched by eternity chose to build rather than simply endure. The ancient dragons, those first children of lightning and stone, had discovered something that would elude all who came after, the secret of making the eternal manifest in the temporal world. Their bodies were themselves works of divine architecture, scaled hide, harder than castle walls, yet glowing with inner fire. Each dragon, a perfect fusion of the geological and the mystical, the earthly and the transcendent. Dragon Lord Placidusax ruled here as the first Elden Lord, though his god was not the greater will that would later cast its golden shadow across the realm. No, his deity was something older, more primal, a force that understood time not as a river flowing in one direction, but as an ocean where all moments exist, simultaneously. The storm that surrounds Placidusax's throne exists beyond time itself, where past and future merge in an eternal present, where what was and what will be dance together in a cosmic waltz that mortal minds can barely comprehend. The dragon's mastery over temporal forces was perhaps their greatest achievement, surpassing even their command of the devastating red lightning that could split mountains and boil seas. Ancient dragon smithing stones, those mysterious remnants of their civilization, are described as lightly twisting time, fragments of crystallized eternity that retained enough power to slay gods, even after their creators had long since turned to common stone. To witness a dragon's death was to see time itself unravel, the great beast's final roar echoing backwards through the centuries to the moment of its birth, creating a loop of sound and fury that could drive listeners mad with its impossible beauty. But the dragons did not rule alone in their floating realm. The beastmen served not as mere slaves or servants, but as partners in a relationship so profound it challenged every assumption about civilization, hierarchy, and the nature of consciousness itself. These half-human, half-canine beings possessed knowledge beyond human understanding, their sophisticated culture evident in the ornate jewelry of unalloyed gold they crafted, the perfectly balanced weapons they forged from dull iron, while maintaining their sacred duties in the dragon catacombs below. The beastmen were priests, guardians, chroniclers, and companions all at once. They understood the dragons not as distant gods to be feared and appeased, but as elder siblings in the great cosmic family, beings who had simply progressed further along the path of enlightenment. In return, the dragons shared their temporal wisdom, teaching the beastmen how to step outside the normal flow of time for brief moments, how to see the patterns that connected all things across the vast tapestry of existence. Together, dragon and beastman created a civilization that functioned on principles entirely foreign to those who would come after. There was no rigid hierarchy, no systematic oppression, no accumulation of wealth or power for its own sake. Instead, there was partnership, dragons providing the vast cosmic perspective of near-immortal beings, while beastmen contributed the detailed knowledge and careful craftsmanship that comes from shorter, more focused lives. The jewelry and weapons they created together were not mere tools or ornaments, but sacred objects that served as bridges between the temporal and eternal realms. The architecture of Farum Azula itself reflected this profound collaboration. Massive stone bridges spanned impossible distances, their construction requiring both draconic strength and beastman engineering. Gothic spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, their geometries following mathematical principles that existed outside normal space-time. The great mausoleums, where ancient dragons were entombed, became centers of worship and learning, places where beastmen could commune with their departed partners and receive visions of futures that might yet come to pass. Yet for all their power, for all their wisdom, for all their perfect synthesis of order and chaos, of eternity and time, the Dragon Empire faced a tragedy that no amount of temporal manipulation could prevent. Their god, that primal force that had first awakened consciousness in the ancient dragons, simply vanished, not destroyed, not defeated, not transformed, but gone, as if it had never existed at all, leaving behind only absence and silence, where once there had been purpose and direction. Placidusax, greatest of the dragon lords, withdrew into his storm beyond time to wait for his god's return. The other ancient dragons scattered across the realm, some retreating into slumber, others seeking new purposes, in a world that no longer made sense to them. The Beastmen, bereft of their draconic partners, gradually forgot the higher mysteries they had once shared, becoming guardians of empty tombs and keepers of traditions whose meanings had been lost. And Farum Azula itself began to crumble, not from any external assault, but from the simple fact that its very existence had been predicated on the presence of the divine. Without their god to anchor it in the cosmic order, the floating city became unstuck in time, its ruins scattered across past, present, and future like fragments of a shattered dream. What remains now is but a shadow of its former glory, crumbling stones suspended in eternal twilight, lightning that strikes without purpose, and the endless sound of wind through empty halls, where once the most perfect civilization in the history of the world had sung its songs of stone and storm. The Dragon Empire stands as proof that there were other ways to build, other ways to rule, other ways to touch the infinite, and perhaps, for those who listen carefully to the thunder echoing through the ruins of Farum Azula, there is still hope that such perfect partnerships between mortal and divine might one day be forged again. Chapter 1: The Floating Kingdom of Stone and Storm. High above the eastern seas, where storm clouds gather in eternal dance, and lightning writes its poetry across the darkening sky, there once floated the most ancient and magnificent of all empires, Farum Azula, the crumbling celestial city of the dragons. Here, in sublime defiance of earthly law and mortal expectation, soared a civilization built from gravel stone, infused with primordial gold, its Gothic spires and impossible arches piercing through the very fabric of time itself like needles through silk. This was no mere city, but a living testament to what could be achieved when beings touched by eternity chose to build rather than simply endure. The ancient dragons, those first children of lightning and stone, had discovered something that would elude all who came after: the secret of making the eternal manifest in the temporal world. Their bodies were themselves works of divine architecture, scaled hide harder than castle walls, yet glowing with inner fire, each dragon a perfect fusion of the geological and the mystical, the earthly and the transcendent. Dragon Lord Placidus Axe ruled here as the first Elden Lord, though his god was not the greater will that would later cast its golden shadow across the realm. No, his deity was something older, more primal, a force that understood time, not as a river flowing in one direction, but as an ocean where all moments exist simultaneously. The storm that surrounds Placidus X's throne exists beyond time itself, where past and future merge in an eternal present, where what was and what will be dance together in harmonies that mortal minds can barely comprehend. The dragon's mastery over these temporal currents was perhaps their greatest achievement, surpassing even their command of the devastating red lightning that could split mountains and boil seas. Ancient dragon smithing stones, those mysterious remnants of their civilization, are described as lightly twisting time, fragments of crystallized eternity that retained enough power to slay gods, even after their creators had long since turned to common stone. To witness a dragon's death was to see time itself unravel, the great beast's final roar echoing backwards through the centuries to the moment of its birth, creating a loop of sound and fury that could drive listeners mad with its impossible beauty. But the dragons did not rule alone in their floating realm. The beastmen served not as mere slaves or servants, but as partners in a relationship so profound it defied every assumption about power and purpose. These half-human, half-canine beings possess knowledge beyond human understanding, their sophisticated culture evident in the ornate jewelry of unalloyed gold they crafted, the perfectly balanced weapons they forged from dull iron while maintaining their sacred duties in the dragon catacombs below. The beastmen were priests, guardians, chroniclers, and companions all at once. They understood the dragons not as distant gods to be feared and appeased, but as elder siblings in the great cosmic family, beings who had simply progressed further along the path of enlightenment. In return, the dragons shared their temporal wisdom, teaching the beastmen how to step outside the normal flow of time for brief moments, how to see the patterns that connected all things across the vast tapestry of existence. Together, dragon and beastman created a civilization that pulsed with rhythms no mortal ever heard. There was no rigid hierarchy, no systematic oppression, no accumulation of wealth or power for its own sake. Instead, there was partnership, dragons providing the vast cosmic perspective of near-immortal beings, while beastmen contributed the detailed knowledge and careful craftsmanship that comes from shorter, more focused lives. The jewelry and weapons they created together were not mere tools or ornaments, but sacred objects that served as bridges between the temporal and eternal realms. The architecture of Farum Azula itself reflected this profound collaboration. Massive stone bridges spanned impossible distances, their construction requiring both draconic strength and beastman engineering. Gothic spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, their geometries following mathematical principles that existed outside normal space-time. The great mausoleums, where ancient dragons were entombed, became centers of worship and learning, places where beastmen could commune with their departed partners and receive visions of futures that might yet come to pass. In the deepest sanctum of one such mausoleum, a single beastman might sit for hours before a crystalline formation that had once been a dragon's heart. The crystal would pulse with faint golden light, and if the beastman placed his hand upon its surface, he could feel the warmth of ancient thoughts, hear whispers of conversations that spanned millennia, sense the weight of wisdom accumulated across eons of existence. These moments of communion were sacred beyond measure, brief touches of infinity that could sustain a mortal soul through years of ordinary time. Time moved differently throughout the floating empire, not merely because of draconic magic, but because the very concept of temporal progression had been reimagined. Beastmen artisans might spend decades perfecting a single piece of jewelry, yet experience those years as mere moments when working in harmony with dragon consciousness. Conversely, a dragon's brief contemplation could span centuries of subjective time, allowing for depth of thought and philosophical consideration that defied mortal comprehension. The red lightning that served as both weapon and sacrament flowed through every aspect of their society. Beastmen warriors learned to channel these crimson bolts not merely for destruction, but for construction, welding stone to stone with electrical precision, carving intricate patterns into metal through controlled lightning strikes, creating art that existed at the intersection of devastating force and delicate beauty. The very air of Farum Azula crackled with potential energy, each breath taken by its inhabitants charged with the raw power of creation itself. Death in this floating realm became not an ending, but a graduation to a different form of existence. When an ancient dragon passed from the world, its body would slowly transform into gravel stone, but its consciousness remained accessible through the mystical properties of that transformed matter. Beastmen priests developed elaborate rituals for communing with these stone dragons, learning to interpret the subtle vibrations and energy patterns that emanated from the crystallized remains, ensuring that wisdom could be preserved and accessed across the generations. The library temples of Farum Azula contained knowledge that spanned not merely history, but all of time itself. Dragon scholars, working in partnership with Beastmen scribes, had developed chronicles that could be read forwards or backwards through time, revealing not only what had been, but glimpses of what would be, what might be, and what could never be. The very act of reading these temporal texts was a form of meditation, requiring the reader to step partially outside normal time and experience existence from a more cosmic perspective. Yet, for all their power, for all their wisdom, for all their perfect synthesis of order and chaos, the Dragon Empire faced a tragedy that no amount of temporal manipulation could prevent. Their god, that primal force that had first awakened consciousness in the ancient dragons, that had taught them the secrets of time and lightning and stone, simply vanished, not destroyed, not defeated, not transformed, but gone, as if it had never existed at all, leaving behind only absence and silence, where once there had been purpose and direction. Some say the god fled when it sensed the approach of something vast beyond measure, a presence so immense it cast no shadow, only silence. Others whisper that it simply grew weary of material existence and chose to dissolve itself back into the primordial chaos from which all things emerge. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible, that even gods can simply lose their way, forgetting themselves until they become nothing more than echoes in the wind. Placidusax, greatest of the dragon lords, withdrew into his storm beyond time, to wait for his god's return, his massive form entering a state of suspended animation that exists outside the normal flow of causality. The other ancient dragons scattered across the realm, some retreating into slumber so deep that grass and trees grew over their dormant forms, others seeking new purposes in a world that no longer made sense to them. The Beastmen, bereft of their draconic partners, gradually forgot the higher mysteries they had once shared, becoming guardians of empty tombs and keepers of traditions whose meanings had been lost. And Farum Azula itself began to crumble, not from any external assault, but from the simple fact that its very existence had been predicated on the presence of the divine. Without their god to anchor it in the cosmic order, the floating city became unstuck in time, its structures aging at different rates, its chambers scattered across past, present, and future like fragments of a shattered dream. The great bridges that had once connected impossible distances now led to empty air, their destinations lost in temporal flux. The Gothic spires that had pierced the fabric of reality now twisted in directions that hurt the mind to perceive. What remains now is but a shadow of its former glory, crumbling stones suspended in eternal twilight, lightning that strikes without purpose or pattern, and the endless sound of wind through empty halls, where once the most perfect civilization in the history of the world had sung its songs of stone and storm. The few visitors who managed to reach this temporal ruin report hearing echoes of voices speaking in languages that predate human speech, seeing shadows moving in rooms where no living thing has walked for centuries, feeling the weight of vast intelligence contemplating problems too complex for mortal minds to grasp. The Dragon Empire stands as proof that there were other ways to build, other ways to rule, other ways to touch the infinite, beyond the rigid doctrines that would later be imposed upon the world. It demonstrates that partnership between species is not only possible, but can achieve heights of civilization that neither could reach alone. Most importantly, it serves as a reminder that even the greatest empires, even the most perfect partnerships, even the most profound understanding of cosmic forces, all these can be lost when the divine presence that sustains them chooses to turn away. And perhaps, for those who listen carefully to the thunder echoing through the ruins of Farum Azula, for those who feel the crackling potential in every lightning strike, for those who sense the weight of draconic intelligence still slumbering in stone, perhaps there is still hope that such perfect partnerships between mortal and divine, between time and eternity, between wisdom and power, might one day be forged again. Chapter 2. The Fires That Burned Before Order. In the frozen peaks of the mountaintops, where ice dragons once reigned and eternal winter holds dominion over stone and sky, there once burned flames that could consume even the gods themselves. This was the realm of the fire giants, those red-haired titans who bore their deity not in temples of marble or gold, but within their very flesh, the grotesque, one-eyed visage of the fell god manifesting directly upon their massive chests, its fiery mouth breathing the primordial flame of ruin that predated all other sacred fires. Here was a civilization drawn ever closer to the flame, built on the most profound act of love imaginable, eternal service to a force so dangerous that its very existence threatened the cosmic order. The fire giants were bound by laws older than memory to tend the flame that burned at the heart of their great forge, a massive stone cauldron carved into the mountain itself, where the flame of ruin danced with such intensity that it could melt the barriers between worlds and transform all it touched into something new and strange and beautiful. Unlike the dragons who commanded time and lightning from their floating realm, or the underground peoples who would later reject all cosmic authority, the fire giants had chosen a path of willing embrace. They understood that their god was not gentle, not concerned with comfort or ease. The fell god was transformation incarnate, the primal urge to burn away all that was false, so that truth might emerge from the ashes. And the giants loved it with a devotion that bordered on ecstasy. To be born a fire giant was to be born into service, your destiny written in the crimson flames that danced behind your eyes from the moment of first breath. Each giant carried within their body a fragment of their god's essence, a living spark that grew and spread as they aged, gradually transforming their flesh into a sacred vessel. The one-eyed face that eventually emerged upon their chest was not a marking or a brand, but the god itself, speaking through willing flesh, breathing fire and shadow and whispered promises of transcendence. The transformation was both blessing and rapture, granting the giants immense power, while slowly merging their consciousness with something infinitely larger than themselves. As the fell god's presence grew stronger within them, the giants would find their mortal concerns fading like morning mist, replaced by an overwhelming joy in tending the sacred flame, in feeding it with offerings of wood and bone and the sweet smoke of burning herbs. They embraced this gradual dissolution of self, viewing it not as loss, but as the highest form of communion with the divine. Their settlements were carved around massive forges and fire pits, structures that seemed to grow from the mountain stone like flowers of flame and shadow. Great cauldrons, some large enough to hold entire buildings, were cut directly into mountainsides and filled with fires that burned without consuming, flames that fed on the spiritual energy of devotion itself, growing brighter and more beautiful as more giants gathered to worship before them. The central forge, where the flame of ruin burned brightest, was a marvel that defied mortal understanding. The stone cauldron was carved with intricate channels and passages that directed the flame's energy in patterns older than civilization, creating sacred geometries that amplified the fire's transformative power beyond measure. Some say the forge was not built, but discovered, carved from living rock by the fell god itself in the earliest days of the world, when fire and stone were still learning to be separate things. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mountain winds carried the scent of ash and ember down through the valleys, a single giant might stand alone before the great forge, feeling the heat wash over his massive form like the breath of creation itself. The flames would whisper to him in a language older than words, and he would understand, perhaps for the first time, why his people had chosen this path of willing surrender. The fire was not destruction, it was revelation, a force that could burn away everything temporary to unveil the eternal truths that lay beneath. The fire giants learned to read meaning in the dance of flame, to interpret the will of their god through the patterns of smoke and ember. Different flames burned for different purposes, some for visions of what might come, others for the purification of hearts and souls, still others for the delicate work of forging weapons and tools from materials that existed only in the spaces between flame and void. They became master craftsmen through their devotion, understanding that creation and transformation were simply different faces of the same cosmic fire. Those who dwelt closest to the central forge were the most transformed, their individual voices almost entirely merged with their god's song, serving as living conduits for divine power. Those who lived farther from the flames retained more of their original selves, serving as the hands and heart of their more transformed kin, carrying out the daily needs of their people, while their brothers and sisters communed directly with the divine in wordless rapture. The fire monks, originally human soldiers sent to suppress the giants during the war that would eventually consume their civilization, found themselves beguiled by the very flames they were meant to extinguish. Fire, it seems, calls to fire, and the mortal warriors discovered that their own souls contained sparks that yearned for the fell god's transformative touch. They abandoned their original mission and became devotees, learning to channel flame through prayers and rituals taught by their former enemies. These converted monks served as bridges between the giant civilization and the wider world, carrying the sacred fire's gentle warmth to distant lands, while ensuring that the mountain flames received the reverence they deserved. They wore robes of deep red and carried burning brands that never consumed, their faces gradually taking on the peaceful expression of those who had found their true purpose in service to something greater than themselves. The relationship between the fire giants and their god was perhaps the most intimate of all the primordial civilizations, where dragons served as partners to cosmic forces and underground peoples sought independence from divine authority. The giants had chosen complete surrender. They offered not just their worship or their labor, but their very essence, allowing themselves to be gradually transformed until the line between lover and beloved became meaningless. This total devotion brought with it a kind of joy that other civilizations might have found incomprehensible. Giants who fully embraced their transformation transcended the loneliness that plagues mortal existence, their consciousness merging into the collective symphony of their god's presence. They could no longer love in the limited way that humans understood love, but they had discovered something infinitely greater, perfect unity with a force that burned at the very heart of creation itself. The end of the fire giant civilization came when the Golden Order decided that such dangerous devotion could not be allowed to continue. Queen Marika's forces, blessed with golden power, systematically hunted down the giants, viewing their sacred flames as a threat to the new cosmic order. The war was sorrowful and prolonged, with entire mountains set ablaze, as giants made their final stands around their beloved forges. When the last giant fell, mortally wounded but still clinging to life, he performed one final act of love that would echo through the ages. Tearing off his own broken leg, he cast it into the flame of ruin, awakening the fell god's power one last time, and ensuring that the sacred fire would continue to burn even after its tenders had passed from the world. In this ultimate offering, the giant demonstrated the truth that had sustained his people through countless generations, that love, even love for forces of transformation, could transcend death itself. The flame of ruin still burns in its mountain forge, tended now by fire monks, who remember the old ways, and maintained by the spiritual residue of giant devotion that has soaked into the very stones. It waits, patient and eternal, for the prophecy that speaks of its ultimate purpose, the day when it will be carried to the foot of the tree itself and used to transform the golden order that destroyed its faithful servants. And perhaps, in the dancing flames that still burn in hidden places throughout the realm, in the whispered prayers of fire monks who remember the old ways, in the dreams of those who feel the call of transformation in their hearts, perhaps the spirit of the fire giants lives on, waiting patiently, like embers in the darkness, ready to kindle once more when the world remembers that sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest surrender, and that from willing sacrifice, something beautiful beyond imagining can always be born. Chapter 3: Spirits of the Ancient Hunt. Deep in the underground forests, where the Shiofra River flows like liquid starlight, and artificial skies twinkle with the memory of celestial bodies, there once flourished a civilization that understood death, not as ending, but as transformation. The Ancestral Followers, the horned folk, who danced to rhythms that pulsed in the very heartwood of existence. Here, beneath the earth, yet somehow closer to heaven than any surface dweller, they maintained one of the most purely spiritual societies the world has ever known. A culture built on the sacred truth that life sprouts from death, as naturally as flowers bloom from soil. These were people who had deliberately chosen simplicity over complexity, wisdom over knowledge, harmony over dominion. While other civilizations reached toward the stars or delved into cosmic mysteries, the Ancestral Followers turned their gaze inward, seeking communion with the spirits that dwelt in the spaces between breath and heartbeat. In the moment when life gives way to something larger and more luminous than mortality alone could ever contain. Their underground realm existed in a state of perpetual twilight, illuminated by phantom trees that glowed with soft blue radiance, and rivers that carried not just water, but the essence of memory itself. The Shiofra and Ainsel rivers flowed through caverns so vast that clouds formed beneath their ceilings, creating weather patterns that followed the emotional tides of the spiritual world rather than the mechanical laws of meteorology. In this place, the boundary between the material and ethereal had worn gossamer thin, allowing the living and the dead to walk side by side in communion that surface dwellers could only dream of achieving. The Ancestral Followers themselves were marked by horns that grew from their heads, like branches reaching towards some invisible sun, spiritual antennae that allowed them to sense the presence of ancestral spirits, to hear the whispered wisdom of those who had passed beyond the veil of ordinary death. The horns grew in patterns unique to each individual, some spiraling like ram's horns, others branching like antlers, each configuration reflecting the spiritual journey of its bearer and serving as a bridge between worlds. They shared their underground paradise with creatures that elsewhere would have fled from human presence, deer and sheep that grazed peacefully among the phosphorescent fungi, birds that sang lullabies to sleeping spirits, wolves that hunted not for flesh, but for the dark energies that could poison the spiritual atmosphere of their sacred realm. The beasts understood instinctively that the horned folk meant them no harm, that these strange humans had learned to live as part of the natural symphony rather than attempting to conduct it according to their will. The relationship between the ancestral followers and their animal companions transcended simple domestication or even friendship. It was a form of spiritual partnership based on mutual recognition of shared mortality and the promise of eventual transformation into something greater. The deer that wandered through their underground forests were not merely animals, but fellow pilgrims on the path towards spiritual evolution, their own deaths and rebirths, part of the same cosmic cycle that would eventually transform all living things into ancestral spirits. In the deepest sanctuaries of their realm, where the roots of the phantom trees formed natural cathedrals, and the air itself seemed to pulse with concentrated life force, the ancestral followers would gather for their most sacred ritual, the eternal hunt. This was not a hunt for meat or hide, but a spiritual practice designed to commune with the ever-budding consciousness of long-lived creatures that had transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. A single follower might spend hours in meditation before a grove where ancient deer grazed among flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names, their antlers glowing with the same soft blue light that emanated from the phantom trees. She would breathe in rhythm with their movements, allowing her consciousness to merge gradually with theirs until she could feel the weight of accumulated memory in their branching horns, sense the wisdom gathered over lifetimes of patient observation and gentle contemplation. The ritual required no violence, no pursuit, no conquest. Instead, it was an act of witnessing, a form of prayer performed through presence and attention. The deer would approach the meditating follower willingly, sensing in her the same spiritual hunger that drove their own endless cycle of growth and renewal. When the moment of communion came, it arrived not as death, but as graduation, the deer's consciousness expanding beyond its mortal form to join the collective memory of all those who had walked this path before. The ancestral followers believed that long-lived beasts developed budding horns that continued to grow throughout their existence, accumulating not just bone and keratin, but spiritual energy, wisdom, and the distilled essence of countless seasons spent in contemplation of the eternal. When these creatures finally transcended their physical forms, their horns became repositories of accumulated consciousness, objects of reverence that could channel the wisdom of the departed and serve as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of ancestral spirits. Where most cultures viewed mortality as a tragedy to be feared or a mystery to be solved, the horned folk saw it as a natural progression, no more frightening or unusual than the changing of seasons or the daily cycle of sleeping and waking. They awaited with patient joy the day when buds would sprout from their own flesh and souls, when their consciousness would expand beyond the limitations of individual existence to become part of the vast interconnected web of ancestral memory. Their music was perhaps their greatest achievement, a form of expression that combined rhythmic foot stamping with haunting lullabies, creating soundscapes that could induce trance states and facilitate communication with the ancestral realm. The drums they crafted from hollowed bones resonated with frequencies that seemed to bypass normal hearing entirely, reaching directly into the soul to awaken memories of lives lived long before birth and deaths that opened doorways to infinite possibility. In the quiet hours when even the phantom trees seemed to hold their breath, the shamans among them would gather the scattered bones of creatures who had passed willingly into the spirit realm. With reverent hands and whispered prayers, they learned to create something beautiful and strange, a blue mist that carried within it the essence of departed consciousness. This spirit vapor could be inhaled to induce visions, used to consecrate sacred spaces, or offered to ancestral spirits as a form of communion and remembrance. The creation required not just technical skill, but profound empathy, the ability to understand and honor the life force that had once animated the bones, ensuring that the transformation from physical to spiritual was performed with the reverence such a sacred process deserved. Their dwelling places were caves and grottos, decorated with simple but profound art, paintings that depicted the journey from life to death, to spiritual transcendence, sculptures carved from living stone that seemed to breathe with accumulated memory, altars where offerings of flowers and fruits were left not for absent gods, but for the ever-present ancestors who continued to guide and protect their descendants. The ancestral followers chose the path of deliberate simplicity, understanding that complexity often obscured rather than revealed spiritual truth. They developed no writing because they believed that the most important knowledge could only be transmitted through direct experience, heart to heart and soul to soul. They avoided metalworking because the natural materials provided by their underground realm contained spiritual properties that artificial refinement could only diminish. Their wisdom flowed like water from one generation to the next, passed down through shared meditation, communal ritual, and the gradual awakening of spiritual perception that came from patient practice and devoted observation. The legacy of the ancestral followers continues to resonate through the underground realms they once called home. The phantom trees still glow with their accumulated memory, the rivers still carry echoes of their lullabies, and the deer that graze in their abandoned sanctuaries still bear the spiritual imprint of countless generations of communion with the horned folk. The ancestral spirits they honored and eventually joined remain present in the sacred groves, offering guidance and wisdom to any who approach with sufficient reverence and patience. Their civilization stands as proof that there were other ways to live, other paths to transcendence that required no conquest of nature or domination of fellow beings. They demonstrated that it was possible to build a world where individual fulfillment came not from accumulation or achievement, but from the gradual dissolution of the ego into something infinitely larger and more beautiful than any mortal personality could hope to become. And perhaps, in the blue mist that still rises from certain bones in hidden places, in the spontaneous appearance of flowers where ancient deer once grazed, in the dreams of those who feel called to seek wisdom in simplicity rather than complexity, perhaps the ancestral followers continue their eternal hunt, pursuing not quarry that can be caught and killed, but truth that can only be approached with empty hands and an open heart, forever seeking the moment when the boundary between hunter and hunted, between seeker and sought, finally dissolves into the luminous unity that was always their true destination. Chapter 4. The cities that chose darkness. Beneath the earth, away from the greater will's cosmic gaze and the golden light that would one day claim dominion over all who dwelt beneath the sky, there flourished 3 cities that dared to forge their own path to divinity. Nokron, Nokstella, and a third, whose name has been lost to the silence that followed its destruction. These were the eternal cities, bastions of defiance, where humanity's boldest children pursued transcendence through their own ingenuity, creating civilizations that actively rejected divine authority and chose instead to trust in the cold brilliance of their own minds and the malleable nature of silver tears. The Nox people, gray-skinned and cold-blooded, had turned their backs on the surface world and all its cosmic entanglements long before the Erd-tree cast its first shadow across the land. They descended into the deepest places of the earth, not in exile or defeat, but in deliberate rejection of any power that would claim authority over their destiny. In the profound darkness of their chosen realm, they lit their own stars, artificial constellations that twinkled with captured starlight, creating skies that belonged to no cosmic order but their own. Their architecture defied every convention of earthbound construction, buildings that hung like stalactites from cavern ceilings, creating inverted cityscapes that seemed to mock the very concept of up and down. Massive structures of pale stone and gleaming metal spiraled downward into the abyss, their foundations rooted not in earth, but in pure defiance, their spires pointing toward depths that promised freedom rather than heights that demanded submission. The Nox had learned to build with gravity as their ally rather than their enemy, creating spaces that existed in perfect harmony with the underground realm they had claimed as their eternal home. In the heart of Noxtella, where artificial starlight painted everything in shades of silver and deep blue, massive chair crypts rose like monuments to ambition itself. These towering stone thrones, carved with intricate floral patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner life, housed the mummified remains of giant night maidens in eternal reverence. The chairs were not mere furniture, but thrones of contemplation, places where the greatest minds of the Nox could sit in meditation for centuries, their consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of mortal thought to encompass possibilities that surface dwellers could never imagine. The night maidens who occupied these thrones had been the wisest and most gifted of their people, women who had achieved a form of immortality through pure intellectual transcendence, their bodies preserved through arts that blended science and sorcery, served as repositories of accumulated knowledge, their minds continuing to work even in death, processing information and developing new theories that would guide their civilization toward its ultimate goal, the creation of their own artificial god. The Nox wore crystalline mirror helms, faceted masks that reflected light in patterns too complex for ordinary minds to follow, creating optical illusions that could confuse divine perception and ward off cosmic intervention. These helms were not mere protection, but statements of philosophy made manifest, declarations that the wearer chose to see reality through their own lens, rather than accepting the visions imposed by distant cosmic forces. The mirrors fragmented and refracted incoming influence, making it impossible for any external power to achieve a clear view of the wearer's true intentions or capabilities. Yet in choosing this path of perfect independence, the Nox had perhaps sacrificed something precious that other civilizations took for granted: the warmth of shared belief, the comfort of belonging to something larger than themselves. Their pursuit of cosmic freedom had led them into a kind of spiritual isolation, where brilliance shone cold as starlight, and every achievement was measured against the vast emptiness they had chosen over divine connection. Their greatest creation, and perhaps their greatest transgression, in the eyes of those who would later judge them, was the Fingerslayer Blade, a weapon forged from meteoric ore and tempered with liquid starlight, capable of harming even the cosmic entities that claim dominion over mortal affairs. This blood-drenched dagger represented the culmination of their technological and mystical arts, a tool that could sever the very connections that bound the world to cosmic authority. The blade's creation invoked the ire of the greater will, marking the Nox as enemies of the established cosmic order and sealing their eventual fate. In the deepest laboratories of Norcron, where captured starlight pooled like luminous mercury, and time seemed to fold like silk around the edges of reality, a single Nox scholar might spend decades perfecting the formula that would give their silver tears true consciousness. These formless creatures of liquid metal could perfectly mimic any opponent, flowing like quicksilver through her pale fingers, responsive to her will yet yearning for something more. True autonomy, genuine thought, the spark of consciousness that would make them more than mere reflections of existing life. She would work in chambers where gravity bent to her will, where tools crafted from crystallized starlight weighed nothing at all yet could cut through any material, pursuing the Nox dream of creating life itself through scientific methodology rather than divine intervention. The Nox had developed their own understanding of magic that differed radically from the cosmic influence sorceries practiced on the surface. Their magic was cold and precise, mathematics made manifest in reality, based on natural laws rather than divine inspiration or cosmic favor. They could manipulate gravity itself, creating fields where objects fell upward or remained suspended in perfect stillness. They learned to weave light into solid constructs, fashioning instruments from frozen starbeams that sang with harmonies too pure for mortal ears. Their society was structured around intellectual achievement rather than birth or divine favor. The greatest minds rose to positions of leadership through the pure merit of their discoveries and innovations. They created vast libraries where knowledge was stored not in books, but in crystalline matrices that could hold entire lifetimes of learning in structures no larger than a human skull. These knowledge crystals could be shared between individuals, allowing the accumulated wisdom of one generation to be directly transmitted to the next without loss or distortion. The Black Moon of Noxtella served as both observatory and weapon, a massive sphere of crystallized darkness that could bend light around itself, creating zones of absolute shadow where their most sensitive experiments could be conducted without cosmic interference. The moon was also capable of projecting beams of condensed darkness that could neutralize incoming divine influence, creating pockets of reality where natural law held sway rather than cosmic whim. Their downfall came not through military defeat, but through cosmic retribution. The Greater Will, recognizing the threat posed by their technological transcendence and their successful creation of weapons capable of harming cosmic entities, decreed their punishment. They were banished underground, cut off from the natural stars they had studied and loved, their artificial constellations unable to fully compensate for the loss of genuine celestial connection. The third city was utterly destroyed by Astel, a malformed star sent as cosmic retribution, its inhabitants scattered like dust across the underground realm. Yet, even in defeat, the Nox maintained their hope for eventual victory. Their descendant agents, the Black Knife Assassins, would later serve in the rebellion against the Golden Order, their Nox-forged weapons proving capable of harming even demigods. The silver tears they created would outlive their civilization, continuing to evolve and adapt in the depths of their ruined cities. The knowledge preserved in their crystal matrices would wait patiently for minds capable of understanding and implementing their revolutionary discoveries. The memory stones scattered throughout the underground realm are fragments of Noxtella's shattered Black Moon, each one containing compressed knowledge that can expand the capacity of any mind that successfully integrates its contents. These stones represent the Nox belief that knowledge itself could transcend the destruction of civilizations, that wisdom properly preserved could survive any catastrophe and eventually find new minds capable of carrying it forward. The eternal cities stand as testament to the power of intellectual rebellion, to the possibility that mortal minds could achieve transcendence through their own efforts rather than depending on the favor of cosmic forces. They proved that it was possible to create wonders that rivaled anything produced by divine intervention, to forge weapons capable of threatening gods, to envision futures where humanity charted its own course among the stars, rather than accepting whatever destiny the cosmos chose to impose. And perhaps, in the silver tears that still flow in hidden places, in the artificial stars that continue to twinkle in abandoned observatories, in the dreams of those who refuse to accept that mortal ambition must always bow to cosmic authority, perhaps the spirit of the Nox endures, waiting for the day when the age of stars they envisioned might finally dawn, when the cold brilliance of mortal intellect will prove capable of outshining even the most radiant divine light, and when the cities that chose darkness will emerge once more to illuminate a universe remade according to their own magnificent and terrible vision. Chapter 5. When beasts were gods. Before the coming of cosmic order, before the establishment of rigid hierarchies that would separate the divine from the mortal, the sacred from the mundane, there existed a time when the boundaries between human and animal, between worshipper and deity, were as fluid as morning mist, a time when beasts walked among mortals, not as subjects to be dominated or resources to be harvested, but as gods in their own right, each species carrying within their forms the sacred mysteries of existence itself. This was the age of primal communion, when humanity understood that consciousness took many forms, and that wisdom could be found in the patient gaze of cattle, the soaring flight of birds, the ancient patience of stone-dwelling creatures, and the wild freedom of those who ran beneath the moon. The people of this forgotten time recognized that every beast carried a fragment of cosmic truth, that their forms and behaviors were sacred texts, written in flesh and instinct, each one offering lessons that no human scripture could ever hope to contain. The great bulls that wandered the primordial plains were revered as living embodiments of strength and fertility, their massive forms moving with a dignity that spoke of earthly power wedded to spiritual wisdom. These were not mere animals, but walking temples, their horns reaching toward heaven like cathedral spires, their breath carrying the scent of fresh earth and growing things. When a bull chose to approach a human settlement, it was seen as a blessing beyond measure, a sign that the forces of creation smiled upon the community and would ensure abundant harvests and healthy children. The people learned to read the sacred language written in the bull's movements. The way it pawed the earth spoke of underground waters. The direction of its gaze revealed the best places for planting. The rhythm of its breathing taught the proper timing for seasonal rituals. To be granted the privilege of touching a sacred bull was to receive a direct transmission of divine knowledge, a moment of connection with the creative forces that shaped mountains and rivers, that brought rain in its season and made the earth fruitful. In the forests where ancient trees grew thick as cathedral columns and sunlight filtered down in golden streams, the bears reigned as sovereigns of the deep woods, their massive forms embodying the perfect balance between gentleness and terrible power. These were the keepers of winter's wisdom, the guardians of the sacred sleep that connects all living things to the deeper rhythms of existence. The people understood that bears carried within their bodies the secrets of death and rebirth, their annual hibernation serving as a living demonstration of how consciousness could withdraw from the world only to return transformed and renewed. When a bear emerged from its winter den, gaunt but alive, the forest people saw in its awakening a reflection of their own spiritual journey, the necessity of withdrawal from worldly concerns, the purification that comes through fasting and solitude, the joy of returning to life with fresh eyes and deeper understanding. They learned to time their own spiritual retreats according to the bear's cycle, entering into meditative states when the great creatures sought their winter sleep, emerging with new insights when spring called the bears back to active life. The great cats that prowled the wild places were revered as masters of the hunt, not for their ability to kill, but for their perfect embodiment of focused intention and patient waiting. In the flowing grace of their movement, the people saw lessons about the proper use of personal power, how to move through the world with confidence yet without arrogance, how to strike when the moment was right yet remain still when action would be premature. The cats taught that true strength lay not in constant aggression but in the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. Beneath the earth, in tunnels and burrows that formed a hidden kingdom parallel to the surface world, the smaller creatures carried their own sacred teachings. The moles and badgers were recognized as the keepers of underground mysteries, their constant digging serving as a metaphor for the spiritual work of excavating truth from the depths of consciousness. The people learned from these earth dwellers that some wisdom could only be found by going deeper, by leaving the bright surface world behind and delving into the dark places where the most profound truths lay buried. In the vast expanses where grass waved like an ocean under endless skies, horses ran wild and free, their flowing manes and thundering hooves embodying the pure joy of movement, the ecstasy of perfect freedom. These were the teachers of liberation, showing through their very existence that it was possible to live unbound by the limitations that seemed to constrain other forms of life. To watch a herd of wild horses racing across the plains was to witness a prayer made manifest, a celebration of life's irrepressible urge toward joy and movement, and the endless exploration of possibility. The people who shared the world with these sacred beasts developed rituals and practices that honored the divine nature of their animal companions. They learned to mimic the movements of different creatures in sacred dances, each gesture carrying the power to invoke the spiritual qualities associated with that particular animal. The bull dance brought strength and fertility. The bear dance facilitated deep meditation and spiritual renewal. The cat dance taught the proper use of personal power. The horse dance awakened the soul's yearning for freedom. These were not mere mimicry or entertainment, but profound spiritual practices that allowed human consciousness to temporarily merge with animal awareness, to experience the world through senses and perspectives that operated according to entirely different principles than human cognition. In these moments of communion, the dancers would feel their ordinary sense of self dissolve, replaced by something larger and more primal, the vast, patient intelligence of the bull, the fierce joy of the running horse, the deep wisdom of the hibernating bear. The shamans of this ancient time were those who had learned to maintain this connection with animal consciousness. Even when not engaged in ritual dance, they could commune directly with the spirits of various creatures, receiving guidance and wisdom that helped their communities navigate the challenges of survival and spiritual growth. Some shamans specialized in particular animals, spending years learning to think and feel as their chosen creature did, gradually transforming their own consciousness until the boundary between human and animal became so thin as to be meaningless. The most gifted among these shamans could actually shapeshift, temporarily taking on the physical form of their animal allies. This was not seen as magic in the way later civilizations would understand it, but as a natural expression of consciousness, freed from the artificial limitations that would later be imposed by more rigid belief systems. The shamans understood that form was fluid, that consciousness could wear different bodies as easily as a person might change clothing, each form offering its own unique perspective on the nature of existence. These beast-worshipping cultures developed a sophisticated understanding of ecology that surpassed anything achieved by later, supposedly more advanced civilizations. They recognized that every creature played a vital role in the great web of life, that the health of the whole depended on the flourishing of each individual part. They learned to live in such harmony with their animal neighbors that their presence actually enhanced, rather than diminished, the natural world, their settlements becoming centers of abundance where both human and animal life could thrive. The decline of beast worship came gradually, as new forms of religion emerged that placed greater emphasis on human specialness and divine transcendence. The cosmic forces that would later shape civilization promoted the idea that humans were fundamentally different from and superior to other forms of life, that true divinity existed only in realms far removed from the earthly concerns of physical existence. The old ways of communion with animal spirits came to be seen as primitive and dangerous, practices that kept humanity bound to the base material world when they should be aspiring to higher, more purely spiritual forms of consciousness. Yet the memory of those ancient connections never entirely disappeared in hidden groves and forgotten temples, in the dreams of those who still felt the call of wild places, in the sudden recognition that passed between human eyes and animal eyes. In moments of unexpected encounter, the old wisdom persisted. The beasts themselves carried forward the sacred teachings, their very existence serving as a living reminder of what had been lost when humanity chose the path of separation over the way of communion. The great stone creatures that still roam certain regions of the world are perhaps the last direct descendants of this ancient time, beings that embody both animal and mineral nature, serving as bridges between the consciousness of living creatures and the deep patience of the earth itself. These stone bears and crystal deer move with the slow dignity of geological time, their presence a reminder that consciousness takes forms far more diverse and wonderful than human understanding can easily encompass. In the gentle approach of cattle that still show no fear of humans, in the patient gaze of horses that seem to look directly into the soul, in the majestic appearance of bears at the edges of human settlements, some echo of the old covenant remains. These moments of recognition speak to something deeper than memory, to a possibility that still exists for those who approach the animal world with the reverence and humility that such sacred encounters require. And perhaps, in the dreams of those who find themselves running with wolves under starlit skies, soaring with eagles above mountain peaks, or standing in patient communion with ancient trees while deer graze peacefully nearby, perhaps the time when beasts were gods has never truly ended, but simply waits in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats, ready to reveal itself again to any who remember that divinity wears as many forms as there are creatures to embody it, and that the sacred can be found not in distant heavens, but in the gentle breath of the nearest living thing. Chapter 6. The Last Free Peoples. In the final moments before the greater will cast its golden shadow across the realm, when the ancient ways still flickered like candle flames in the growing darkness of cosmic order, there existed scattered tribes and forgotten peoples who clung to their independence with a fierce joy that burned brighter for knowing it could not last forever. These were the last free peoples communities that had witnessed the rise and fall of the great empires, that had seen dragons retreat to their crumbling citadel and giants consumed by their own sacred flames, yet somehow remained unbroken, unclaimed, unbound by any authority save their own ancient customs and the wild songs that echoed in their hearts. They were the remnants of older times, the survivors of civilizations that had chosen different paths, the inheritors of wisdom traditions that predated all the cosmic interventions that would soon reshape the world according to divine will. In hidden valleys where mist clung to ancient stones, on remote islands where the sea sang lullabies older than memory, in deep forests, where sunlight filtered down through leaves that had never known the touch of golden grace. These peoples maintained their sovereignty through the simple act of remembering who they had always been. The Zamor, those warriors of ice and bitter wind, were perhaps the most defiant of all the free peoples. In the frozen peaks, where even the fire giants feared to tread, they had carved out a realm of perpetual winter, their blue-skinned forms moving through blizzards like dancers in a cosmic ballet. They served no god, acknowledged no cosmic authority, owing allegiance only to the ancient ice that flowed in their veins and the storms that sang in their souls. Their civilization was built on the principle that freedom was worth any price, even the price of eternal cold, eternal struggle, eternal resistance against any force that would claim dominion over their frozen homeland. The Zamor had learned to find beauty in harshness, wisdom in suffering, strength in the kind of adversity that would break lesser peoples. They crafted weapons from ice that never melted, wove clothing from the fur of beasts that thrived in impossible cold, built settlements that could withstand avalanches and blizzards that would bury entire cities. Their shamans could call down storms with a whisper, freeze rivers with a touch, summon ice warriors from the frozen breath of the mountains themselves. Yet for all their power over winter's forces, the Zamor understood that their greatest strength lay not in their magic, but in their absolute refusal to submit. When cosmic powers offered them warmth in exchange for worship, they chose cold and freedom. When divine forces promised them ease in return for service, they selected hardship and independence. They would rather rule in frozen waste than serve in golden paradise, and their choice echoed through the ice caves, where their children learned to dance with blizzards before they could walk without stumbling. In the swamplands where poisonous flowers bloomed in impossible colors, and the very air shimmered with toxic beauty, the clean rot knights maintained their vigil against forces that sought to corrupt the natural world. These were not knights, in the sense that later ages would understand, bound by oaths to distant lords or cosmic authorities, but free warriors who had chosen to dedicate their lives to preserving the delicate balance between life and decay, between growth and dissolution, between the creative forces that brought forth new life and the destructive powers that cleared space for renewal. The clean rot knights had learned to see beauty in putrefaction, to find sacred meaning in the cycle of rot that fed new growth. They wore armor grown from living fungi, wielded weapons that bloomed with spores that could heal or harm, depending on the wielder's intent, rode mounts that were neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something strange and wonderful that existed in the liminal space between states of being. Their understanding of life transcended the rigid categories that other civilizations imposed, recognizing that death and birth, corruption and purification were simply different faces of the same eternal process. Deep beneath the earth, far below even the eternal cities, the ancient dynasty maintained their mysterious civilization in chambers carved from living rock and illuminated by oracle bubbles that floated like captured dreams through the darkness. These were the descendants of humanity's oldest experiments with sorcery, people who had learned to work with forces so primal that they predated even the cosmic interventions that would later reshape magical practice according to divine will. The ancient dynasty had mastered the art of speaking with stone, of convincing metal to flow like water, of persuading light to take solid form and serve their purposes. Their claimant servants were not slaves, but partners in a grand experiment that sought to blur the boundaries between organic and inorganic, between consciousness and mineral patience, between the quick thoughts of mortal minds and the slow contemplations of geological time. In their deep palaces, time moved differently, measured not in heartbeats or seasons, but in the patient accumulation of wisdom that came from understanding how to listen to the very bones of the earth. On distant shores where the sea met the sky, in an endless dance of blue and silver, fishing villages maintained traditions that had never been written down, never been codified into formal religion, never been claimed by any cosmic authority because they existed in the spaces between official notice. These coastal peoples lived by rhythms older than empire, the rhythm of tides, the migration patterns of fish, the seasonal changes that brought different gifts from the ocean's depths. They practiced a form of magic so subtle that outsiders might mistake it for simple skill, so natural that it seemed like ordinary fishing or seamanship or weather reading, rather than the profound manipulation of elemental forces that it actually represented. Their boats could ride storms that would shatter larger vessels, their nets could find fish in empty seas, their weather workers could call down rain or summon favorable winds with prayers so ancient that the words themselves had become pure sound, pure intention, pure communion with forces that had never acknowledged any authority but the moon's pull and the ocean's eternal conversation with the shore. In mountain valleys hidden behind walls of mist and stone, small communities of stargazers maintained observatories that had been recording celestial movements since before the first cosmic intervention. These were not the grand academies that would later develop around formal magical practice, but humble collections of farmers and shepherds who had discovered that watching the sky with sufficient patience and devotion could reveal patterns that spoke directly to the soul without need for interpretation by priest or scholar. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, not in books, but in songs, not in formal schools, but around evening fires, where elders would point to specific constellations and tell stories that contained within them precise mathematical relationships, astronomical observations, and mystical insights that could guide everything from planting schedules to personal spiritual development. They understood that the stars were not distant lights, but living beings whose movements created a cosmic music that could be heard by those who knew how to listen with more than their ears. The wild folk who roamed between settlements, claiming no permanent territory, but moving according to patterns known only to themselves, carried with them oral traditions that preserved fragments of every civilization that had ever existed in the realm. They were living libraries, walking museums, human repositories of songs and stories, and ritual practices that would otherwise have been lost when their parent cultures fell to war, or time, or cosmic intervention. These wanderers served as bridges between the isolated communities of free peoples, carrying news and knowledge and new songs from one hidden valley to another, ensuring that no group remained completely isolated, even in their fierce independence. They knew the secret paths that avoided the growing influence of cosmic authorities, the hidden springs where ancient powers still flowed undisturbed, the sacred groves where the old gods still occasionally manifested for those who approached with proper reverence and understanding. Among all these diverse communities, there ran a common thread, the understanding that freedom was not merely political or social, but spiritual, that true independence required maintaining connection to sources of meaning and power that existed outside any cosmic hierarchy. They shared an intuitive recognition that the forces seeking to impose order upon the world were not necessarily evil, but that the price of submission would be the loss of something irreplaceable, the wild diversity of human spiritual experience, the countless different ways that consciousness could explore its relationship with the divine. The end came not with conquest, but with seduction, not through force, but through the gradual erosion of the conditions that made independence possible. As the Golden Order consolidated its power, as the cosmic influence of the Greater Will grew stronger, the spaces between official authority grew smaller and smaller. The hidden valleys were mapped, the secret paths were discovered, the remote islands were claimed by expanding empires that served the new cosmic order. One by one, the free peoples faced the choice that their ancestors had successfully avoided: submit to cosmic authority or face extinction. Some chose resistance and were destroyed, their defiance remembered only in the songs of the wanderers who witnessed their final stands. Others chose submission and were absorbed into the growing empire, their distinctive cultures gradually fading as their children learned to think and dream according to patterns imposed by golden grace. Yet even in defeat, the free peoples achieved a kind of victory that their conquerors could never fully understand or eradicate. In choosing independence over security, struggle over ease, diversity over unity, they had demonstrated that human consciousness possessed an inherent wildness that no cosmic order could completely tame. Their example would continue to inspire those who came after, a reminder that other ways of being were possible, that the current order was not inevitable, that somewhere in the spaces between thoughts and in the pauses between heartbeats, the spirit of freedom still flickered like an eternal flame. And perhaps, in the dreams of those who wake with ancient songs on their lips, in the sudden recognition of patterns that connect all living things, in the inexplicable urge to wander beyond the boundaries of settled life, perhaps the last free peoples have never truly disappeared, but simply retreated into the hidden places within the human heart, waiting for the day when the cosmic order loosens its grip and the wild flowers of independent consciousness can bloom once more in gardens that owe their beauty to no authority but the ancient laws of growth and change, and the endless dance between order and chaos that gives meaning to existence itself. Chapter 7. The Silence Before the Storm. There comes a moment in all endings when the world seems to hold its breath, when even the wind pauses in its eternal wandering, and the very stones seem to listen for something that has not yet arrived, but already casts its shadow across everything that is. This was such a moment, the final heartbeat of the Age of Freedom, the last exhale before the cosmic order would reshape reality according to its will, the silence that settles over all things when they sense that change beyond imagining approaches on wings of starlight and inevitability. In the scattered settlements of the last free peoples, in the hidden valleys where ancient songs still echoed, in the deep places where old powers slumbered, something had begun to shift. It was not a sound or a sight, not a feeling that could be named or a vision that could be described, but rather an absence, the gradual withdrawal of something that had always been present, leaving behind a hollow space where wonder and wild magic had once flowed as freely as mountain streams. The shamans felt it first, those men and women whose consciousness dwelt halfway between the mortal realm and the spirit world. They woke from dreams they could not remember, but which left them weeping, spoke of visions that slipped away like smoke the moment they tried to give them words. In the dragon ruins of Farum Azula, the beastmen found their rituals changing without conscious decision, their chants taking on new harmonies that seemed to prepare for something vast approaching from beyond the edge of all known music. The fire giants felt the flame of ruin itself burn with a different quality of light, not diminished, but somehow more concentrated, as if gathering its strength for a purpose. that even the fell god had not fully revealed. Deep in their underground sanctuaries, the Ancestral Followers found their spirit communion growing more profound yet more distant, as if the ancestral realm itself was preparing to withdraw behind veils that would soon become impermeable to mortal perception. The deer that had once approached their shamans without fear now grazed at the edges of vision, always just beyond reaching distance, their antlers glowing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the phosphorescent trees. But it was not only the sacred places that felt the change. The very elements themselves began to behave strangely. Fire burned colder, water flowed uphill. In certain streams, where no earthly force could explain the phenomenon, stones hummed with subsonic frequencies that made sensitive listeners weep without knowing why. The aurora that had once danced in northern skies began to appear in southern regions, painting the darkness with colors that had no names and patterns that seemed to carry messages in a script that bypassed the eyes entirely and wrote itself directly upon the soul. Even the wild animals that had never known human contact seemed to sense the approaching transformation. Flocks of birds altered their migration patterns without explanation, following routes that led nowhere any living creature remembered, but which seemed to trace invisible lines of force across the sky. Wolves gathered in places they had never gathered before, not to hunt but to howl songs that sounded like mourning, like farewell, like prayers to powers that had not yet revealed themselves. In hidden libraries, where the last keepers of ancient knowledge maintained their vigil, scholars found their texts beginning to change, words rearranging themselves when no one was looking, new passages appearing overnight in scripts that resembled their familiar languages, but somehow meant more than the words should have been able to contain. Maps showed new territories that existed nowhere on Earth, yet felt more real than the ground beneath their feet. The seers and prophets, who had always dwelt on the margins of their communities, dismissed by practical folk as madmen and dreamers, suddenly found themselves sought out by leaders and common people alike. Their ravings, which had once been incomprehensible nonsense, now carried an urgency and coherence that frightened those who heard them. They spoke of a star that would fall upward, of light that would cast shadows deeper than any darkness, of order so perfect it would remake chaos itself into patterns that sang with mathematical precision. The children born in those final days carried marks that had never been seen before, not deformities, but subtle differences that suggested they belonged more to the world that was coming than to the one that was ending. They cried less than normal infants, slept more peacefully, and when they did make sounds, those sounds sometimes carried harmonies that made adults stop whatever they were doing and listen with expressions of wonder and inexplicable longing. The ancient stones that had stood since the world's beginning, dolmens and monoliths, circles and towers that had been raised by forgotten peoples for purposes no living soul could remember, began to emit a barely perceptible humming, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with something vast approaching from the direction of eternity. Those sensitive to such emanations reported that the stones were not creating the sound, but receiving it, serving as resonating chambers for music that originated somewhere beyond the edge of all known space. And in the deepest places, where the earth's bones lay bare, and the first fires still burned with heat from the world's creation, something stirred that had slumbered since the beginning of time. The mountains themselves began to shift, not in any way that could be measured by mortal instruments, but in a reorientation of purpose that those who lived among them could feel in their very bones. Some few among the wisest began to understand that what approached was not conquest in any sense they had previously understood, not the victory of one power over another, but transformation so complete that the very nature of existence would be fundamentally altered. They spoke in whispers of cosmic forces that dwelt beyond the realm of good and evil, beyond the concepts of freedom and slavery, beyond any moral framework that mortal minds could construct. The silence that settled over all these signs and portents was not the absence of sound, but its opposite, a fullness so complete that it contained within itself every note that had ever been played and every word that had ever been spoken, a cosmic pause that held its breath, not in emptiness, but in anticipation of music so beautiful and terrible that reality itself would need to be rebuilt in order to contain it. As the last free peoples gathered in their hidden places for what they somehow knew would be their final celebrations of the old ways, as the survivors of ancient civilizations tended flames and sang songs and performed rituals that felt more like farewells than worship, the silence deepened. It was the silence of seeds before they sprout, of night before it yields to dawn, of ice before it becomes water. It was the silence that comes when one age ends and another begins, when the old gods gather their robes about them and step aside to make room for powers that dwarf even their ancient majesty. And in that silence, those who knew how to listen could hear it approaching, not footsteps, for it moved beyond the realm where footsteps could echo, not wings, for it flew through spaces where air had never existed, not voice, for it spoke in languages that predated words themselves. What approached was order incarnate, or made manifest, the kind of cosmic authority that shapes reality, not through force, but through the simple fact of its existence, the way that light shapes darkness, not by fighting it, but by being itself so purely that shadow becomes merely the place where illumination has not yet reached. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. And so we reach the end of another journey through the forgotten histories of the lands between. Another evening spent walking slowly through the ruins of what once was, listening to the echoes of civilizations that dared to dream their own dreams of transcendence before the golden light claimed dominion over all who dwelt beneath the sky. Tonight we have witnessed the lost empires they don't want you to know about, the floating cities where dragons and beastmen built partnerships that transcended the boundaries between species, the mountain peaks where giants willingly offered themselves to flames that could burn even gods, the underground forests where the horned folk danced with spirits in eternal communion, the inverted citadels where the Nox forged weapons capable of harming cosmic entities themselves, the forgotten times when beasts walked among mortals as gods deserving of reverence and love, and the scattered tribes who chose freedom over security, even when they knew such choices could not last forever. In their stories, we have glimpsed a world far richer and more wondrous than the rigid order that would eventually consume them, a realm where there were as many paths to divinity as there were souls brave enough to walk them, where wisdom could be found in flame and stone, in spirit and star, in the patient breath of cattle and the wild flight of birds, in the cold brilliance of mortal intellect and the warm communion of shared consciousness across the boundaries of species and death. Each of these civilizations chose their own way of touching the infinite, their own method of communion with forces beyond mortal understanding. The dragons mastered time itself, bending the flow of moments to their will while sharing their temporal wisdom with devoted partners. The fire giants surrendered themselves completely to transformation, allowing their very flesh to become vessels for divine fire. The ancestral followers found transcendence through harmony with nature and death, understanding that endings were merely doorways to larger forms of existence. The Nox proved that mortal minds could create wonders that rivaled divine intervention, that technology and will could forge paths to power that owed nothing to cosmic authority. The beast-worshipping peoples demonstrated that consciousness wore infinite forms, that wisdom could be found in every creature that drew breath, that the sacred was not distant but present in every moment of communion between different forms of awareness. And the last free people showed that independence itself was a form of worship, that choosing one's own path was perhaps the highest expression of the divine spark that burned within all conscious beings. But we have also witnessed the silence that settled over this magnificent diversity, the cosmic pause that preceded the arrival of forces so vast they would reshape reality itself according to principles that transcended any mortal framework of understanding. In that silence, we heard the approaching footsteps of order incarnate, the whisper of cosmic will preparing to remake the world in its own image, the first stirrings of the storm that would sweep away the old ways, not through violence, but through the simple fact of its overwhelming presence. The empires we have remembered tonight were not destroyed because they were evil or because they had failed in their pursuits. They fell because they represented something that the new cosmic order could not tolerate, the wild diversity of consciousness exploring its relationship with the divine through means that no authority had sanctioned, the infinite creativity of beings who refused to accept that there was only one way to touch the eternal, the magnificent chaos of freedom expressing itself through countless different forms of transcendence. Yet in remembering their stories, in walking slowly through the ruins of their achievements, in listening to the echoes of their songs and prayers and defiant laughter, we honor something that no cosmic order can ever fully eradicate, the truth that consciousness itself is wild and uncontainable, that the divine spark within every soul yearns not for submission, but for expression, not for uniformity, but for the beautiful chaos of infinite possibility. The golden light that approaches at the end of our tale will indeed transform everything, will establish an order so complete that the old ways will become not just forbidden, but impossible. But it cannot change what has already been, cannot erase the fact that other paths once existed, cannot diminish the glory of what was achieved when beings were free to seek transcendence through their own chosen means. And perhaps, in the spaces between the rigid structures of the new order, in the shadows cast by golden light, in the dreams of those who remember that there were once other ways, perhaps something of this ancient diversity still flickers, waiting for the day when the cosmic wheel turns again, and consciousness is once more free to explore the infinite through means that no authority has predetermined. The fire still burns by your side, dear traveler, casting its warm light against the gathering darkness. The stories we have shared tonight join the countless others that preserve the memory of what once was and what might yet be again. Rest now in the knowledge that diversity of spirit can never be fully extinguished, that freedom once tasted leaves an aftertaste that no amount of order can completely cleanse from the soul. Until we meet again in night's embrace, where forgotten histories whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen, where the echoes of lost civilizations still dance in the shadows between firelight and dream, sleep well. And remember that every ending is also a beginning. Every silence contains the seed of new songs, and every empire that falls leaves behind traces of its glory for those who seek to understand that there are always other ways to touch the infinite. The fireplace crackles softly as the last embers settle into gentle glowing, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the night wind, You might just hear the faint echo of ancient songs, still being sung by voices that refuse to be silenced, still celebrating the magnificent truth that consciousness, in all its wild and wonderful forms, can never truly be contained.